July is Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. We know from years of research that there are risk factors associated with being a member of a minority group that can result in increased rates of mental illness. And we also know that access to mental health services for those groups can present unique cultural challenges. Today's conversation centers around the mental health of minority student athletes. Myself, along with my colleagues from around the Big 12, are excited to talk about mental health and the impact that it has on our minority students. So let's start with introductions. I'm Monique Marshbell. I'm a clinical psychologist and the Assistant Athletic Director for Mental Health Services at Baylor University.
Hi, my name is Christy Baumschen, and I'm a licensed vascular social worker, and I am from the University of Kansas, Student Athlete Wellness Coordinator.
Hey everybody, I'm Annie Weiss. I'm a licensed psychologist and the Director of Mental Wellness and Sports Psychology at Kansas State University.
Hi everybody, Dr. Dolores Christian, I'm a licensed psychologist and the Assistant Director for Psychological Resources for OU student athletes here at the University of Oklahoma.
Hello, I'm Trevor Richardson, a licensed psychologist here at Oklahoma State, and I am the Director of Counseling and Sports Psychology.
I'm Matt Johnson. I'm a licensed professional counselor and a mental performance consultant here at Texas Christian University.
Hey everyone, I'm Dana Charbonneau. I'm a licensed psychologist and the Director of Clinical and Sports Psychology at West Virginia University.
Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Tyler Bradstreet, psychologist here at Texas Tech, and I'm the Director of our Clinical and Sports Psychology program. So today, Monique and I will be acting as a moderator for this informal roundtable discussion, and really just wanted to jump in. And one of the things that I've always appreciated about this group is we have a lot of diverse experiences, expertise, and anytime we've been having a conversation over the last 2 years, I've always personally walked away feeling inspired, and I feel like I can always lean on this group to learn and grow. And hopefully, I think the same thing can happen here today. So we've got a couple of questions, and maybe we'll just start off with this first one. What differences have you noticed about student athletes of color in terms of their approach to mental health services compared to their white counterparts at your university?
Here at Oklahoma State University, I have noticed in general, when I'm working with a new team, the student athletes of color tend to be a little slower to warm up to me as far as initiating services. And so, what I try to do is make jokes about being an old white guy and try and just deal with it head on. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. And so usually I have a lot better luck at when there's a student athlete of color that does initiate services, doing my best to just make a good connection with that individual. And typically that individual will go out and tell other teammates. And then those are the times where I see our student athletes of color here utilize my services more when they've had a friend or a teammate that referred them in. But in general, they tend to be a little bit slower to utilize my services.
I agree with you. I think that oftentimes, I think all student athletes, but particularly the trust in building that relationship and knowing who you are and hearing from peers is so important. And I often spend a lot of time in training rooms and the building of where student athletes are. And that's how I end up seeing student athletes more than referral based, is just gaining those relationships from informal relationships and conversations and SAC meetings and things like that. So I'm seen more as maybe a person first than somebody who delves really into mental health. And so that's really been a great benefit by where my office is located, really close to the training room. And so I've been really intentional of trying to spend my time there when I'm not seeing student athletes. So
I think OU is really similar to what Trevor was describing for OSU. right now our staff identifies as all white, and we've gotten really explicit feedback from some of our student athletes of color that has impacted their ability, or not their ability, but their desire to come in. We had one of our student athletes was on a mental health panel about a year ago, I'd say, kind of campus wide, and was very transparent and saying like, pros is great, but they don't look like me. So I'm not going to go in and, tell my story. And I think it was such a moment for us to, on one hand, as a white identified provider, I could take that personally and say, but I am in the training room, but I'm a person, right? I'm skilled. And I think our staff and our administration really saw it as the other of, we're not being responsive to this population's needs, right? About half of our student athletes identify as a student athlete of color. So this is a huge population that if even a fraction of them don't feel like we're an accessible resource because our staff doesn't look like them, that's something we really need to respond and attend to. We've done that in a couple of different ways. One, we are hiring a new provider who will start with us in September. We were very intentional in our search to make sure we reached out to providers of color networks, MOA through the NCAA, to try and get a pool that would represent the diversity of our student athletes as well, and feel like we're really lucky that we hired somebody who is a standout clinician and also identifies as a woman of color. And then the other way that we've tried to be more responsive to is in our internship, and really it's kind of similar, make sure we're recruiting diverse interns to just apply, to interview, and then hopefully to match with us. So that way they also have not just one person, but several people. Since we totally respect and see that as a staff, OU overall is about 75% white. So we're not coming close to looking and mirroring our student athlete population too. And that impacts services for sure.
I'm glad that you all were really intentional about that. So from the other side, being a woman of color, our athletes of color, sometimes the response is a shock because a lot of our student athletes of color don't feel like people of color use mental health services. So seeing that the person that's providing mental health services is a person of color, sometimes I get to make that connection with them just off of that. And so I feel like I've been able to connect in different ways with some of our student athletes of color because I do look like them. And so that's been really helpful for me to be able to get them into counseling. Sometimes they come just because they want to sit down and talk and I'm the confidential place and they know I can't tell anyone, but that first step in the door is really important to get them to come back if they ever need services for other things.
Yeah, I'd echo what's been said as well. Our athletes of color are much more cautious, I would say, in initiating services and approaching me. Some things that I've actively tried to do to reach out in a different way are to educate our support staff on the process of therapy, my background in education, the space that I try to create for our athletes. And it's because I found that my athletes are much more willing to approach me if I've been supported by someone that's already close to them in other ways. So I try to build those relationships, educate them. Also, any chance I get to tell them that I played basketball in college, I take. I'm with no shame, because if that is a way that they could think I might understand their lived experiences, I'll take everything I can get. And we've implemented a rule that if there's been a major injury, our athletes have to have a consultation with me. And I found that really does a great job of opening the door later when those athletes have other struggles. They've already met with me. They had to come in and meet with me. So it wasn't them being vulnerable and making that first step. So those are ways that I've tried to build that bridge to our athletes of color.
If I may piggyback on something Annie threw out there as far as the injuries, one of the very, very few bright spots of COVID-19 is we've implemented, I'm doing follow-up phone calls with every student athlete who has been quarantined, whether through a positive or through contact. And so there's been another way where I've got to interact in a one-on-one basis over the phone with some of our student athletes of color. And they've been real appreciative that I've actually even called them. So that's something that my hope is down the road that continues to generate that relationship that we're trying to reach out and bridge that gap.
I'm impressed that they picked up the phone.
Yeah. Do you have a Snapchat, Trevor? Because that would be a way to do it.
I'm not up on all that, and I fully intend that they don't, but I think when they're in quarantine, they are so bored, and even Netflix gets old, that they actually answer. And I'm always surprised. They sometimes they even answer like 1 or 2 rings, and they answer. I'm like, oh, I was just planning on leaving a message or calling back or sending me a text back. But it's been great.
What about other minority groups? So I know we have a lot of international student athletes. Baylor, we're a Christian institution, predominantly Baptist, and so we think about our student athletes of other religions, not just our students of color, but some other minority student athletes that we might interact with.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when I think about this question, and I think I was initially thinking about it just with our student athletes of color, but I think this could definitely be extrapolated to our athletes who are international, or anybody who shares a minority identity. You know, I think we do a really good job to try to demonstrate, you know, cultural competency, broadly speaking, with our staff and make sure that they do feel welcome. But I think the reality is just because of the system and the lack of diversity within our mental health staff or just our athletic department in general leads to those students using us from either a consultation standpoint or when the house is on fire, so to speak, when there's a really tough issue going on and they're in the heat of the moment and they're at that point where like, I need help. I can put down my fears, my concerns and deal with, you know, get that support in that moment. But what seems to happen with, again, those international students or student athletes of color is they don't tend to continue through therapy from a long-term standpoint. Once that immediate problem is resolved, they tend to drop off. And I mean, again, my guess is it's probably because of the system and some of the concerns about representation and, you know, does this person truly understand me? Can I actually feel comfortable in this environment?
Mm-hmm.
It also just reminds me, so this past year, Big 12 SAC made diversity and inclusion their kind of theme for the year. And so that was something that came up in our SAC meetings a lot. And how can we do more as a collective within our student athlete population to highlight and celebrate more of our diverse student athletes and let them have those spaces where they can celebrate their unique cultural experience and things like that. And it has still been hard to get that going a little bit. And I think with the recent, you know, more of the post George Floyd and us talking more about our Black student athlete experience, we've developed like a Mountaineer perspective programming moving forward, where we're hoping to have more ongoing dialogue where our student athletes can, I know it's going to be through Zoom right now, jump on these calls and have spaces to share their experience. And we've started with the Black student athlete experience, but we're hoping to also bring in some of our other minority student athletes and sharing their unique experiences as well. So that's kind of something that we've had on our agenda, but it is some feedback that we also recently received from our Black student athletes, but this can also relate to other minority student athletes, is when we get to campus, sometimes we're not always intentionally connected with other campus groups. And so how can we do that sooner than later, even from the recruitment process? And then, yeah, when we get to campus, like, can you connect me to the International Student Office sooner than later? Can you connect me to our Center for Black Culture and Research sooner than later, so I can have this other family and community outside of athletics too? Because I think sometimes, as much as athletics is our family and our community, sometimes we don't always have as rich of resources as they could also access on campus.
We've taken a similar approach at OU with our Athletes United groups. So in the spring of 2019, so about a year and a half ago, we formed groups for student athletes of colors and a separate men's and women's group. And then in a parallel process, a group for white identified aspiring allies, because it's not just enough to create spaces for our minority student athletes, but we also need the folks who hold the power, even amongst their teams and peer groups, to be able to think about the ways that they're abusing that privilege or not aware of it and can become better allies. So that has been really successful for us. About a year and a half ago, the men of color group would have like maybe 1 or 2 show up, and women of color was like 8 and maybe 2 allies. And before COVID hit, we probably had around 30 student athletes of color for the men's and women's groups, and about 8 or 9 in the white ally group. So we found that has created a big community space, kind of what Dana, you're describing, but more inter-team related, especially for the athletes who identify as one or one of a few athletes of color on their team. Like we have some white teams that there's literally one Black athlete in a team of 40. So to give that person a space to connect and meet other student athletes that they may distantly see in the training room has been, per their feedback, like really enriching and fulfilling. But Monique, to your question, we know that Athletes United can be so much more than the groups that we have. So we've talked about doing an ally group, like a lavender ally group. So queer student athletes and straight allies can come together in that space, and then a group for international student athletes as well. So that was, again, our plan pre-COVID. And we hope, I think, to get back in that in the fall, because we know that those are definitely two groups that could use more support, in Oklahoma, that we could easily offer them to, again, create more community and connection there too.
Can I ask a question to kind of follow up on that? How are you guys handling, because I know that like you all, we are talking avidly to our student athletes with our KU Rise and on Zoom mostly. How are you maintaining the connection of getting some initiatives started up while getting kind of the pulse of the room and feeling like you're maintaining direction and getting buy-in and feeling like you're getting the feeling from all student athletes through Zoom? Because it's difficult to be around a room. It's different to be around a room with people in the same, in the same space, and you can really come together. We've had lots of Zoom calls with our KU Rise group that have been very emotional, but it's different than having these conversations in person, where there can be kind of a healing process afterwards, right? And how has that been for you guys in your experiences? Similar in that it's been empowering at the same time, but difficult?
For me, it really depends on the makeup of the group, right? It definitely is challenging to get that connection piece.
Yes.
And so it's been really hit or miss. I think whenever we have student athletes within these groups, in these conversations that are courageous enough to speak out
Yes.
on a Zoom call with 40 people and really put it out there, and then if that gets the ball rolling, or maybe there's another teammate that they're close with, that it kind of just gets that conversation moving forward. I've seen those calls become, where you feel like, man, this feels kind of like if we were in a group room or a therapy room.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
There's definitely those times where it feels, I don't know if force is the right word, but you're just not getting that same human connection in that conversation through Zoom.
I would just say that I think the breakout room function has helped with like having the smaller discussions, which can sometimes help with that comfort and trust piece in sharing, and then you can bring it back to the larger group. So I think that's been helpful in splitting it up into smaller groups and getting more rich discussion that way.
Yes.
We've also had to take more control as facilitators, which sucks. Hey, Annie, what do you think? You've been quiet, right? Monique and Dana, I see you nodding your heads, and trying to do those normal group facilitation skills to create more of that conversational feel in Zoom has been another way we've tackled that too.
And I think setting ground rules at the beginning, which is part of that also, like your video on, I joke in some of our groups that I'm a ceiling fan repairman or something, because it's just like camera up to the ceiling and I hardly ever see faces. So setting those ground rules before the meeting starts, I think helps really facilitate at least the illusion of eye contact, which helps.
Yes. I like that. I like that. The ceiling fan.
Thinking about outside of athletics, Dana kind of already brought this up. So all of us are at predominantly white institutions. A lot of us are in smaller cities that maybe lack diversity in ways. What if student athletes thought about coming to our campuses, moving into these new towns that maybe are a lot different than what they grew up around? Or you come and you take this tour during recruiting, but then when you actually move in there and your family kind of hits you, how it's really different. So what have your student athletes shared about that transition piece, either campus or even the community around your campus?
we've actually gotten a lot of really rich feedback about the recruiting process itself, how, especially for parents of athletes of color, they feel uncomfortable almost sending, or the thought of sending their athlete, because almost everyone they see on the recruiting visit is a white person. And so they've asked, where are all the Black people? And it's a major need of our staff. And also we do have a lot of support staff of color that we need to be more intentional about making a part of our recruiting visit, so that our athletes, when they step foot on our campus, know that there are resources for them immediately. But that's a major challenge for us. I have tried to bring this up in a therapeutic way in therapy sessions with my especially Black student athletes. And it was almost like pre-George Floyd. It was almost like, it's not, I'm used to it, or it's not, I've just had to live with it my whole life, so it's fine. But then it's only been, for me, post George Floyd, where my athletes have felt more comfortable opening up and talking about the challenges they faced in Manhattan, almost as if it's given them permission to be really open and honest and vulnerable about it. And I have intentionally tried to be a part of these conversations about race with our athletes, so that they at least know where I stand, and maybe that helps open a door for them to be more honest about their experience.
Right. I think like the conversations that have come up here too, post, George Floyd's murder, has been, wow, does my athletic department, who are primarily white, does this community in Lubbock, Texas, in West Texas, who cheer us on, do they really care about me? There's that questioning of like, not many people look like me, and they're seeing some of the discourse that's going on in society and wondering like, how comfortable is it actually to be here if I'm a football player in this stadium with 60,000 people? How many people actually would care about me outside of this role? And I think to your point, because there is starting to be more support, and they're feeling more that they have more power to have these conversations, I'm seeing more student athletes step out and ask those questions and expect answers, and expect answers that they can be satisfied with.
And the courage to ask those questions in a very public way, it's pretty amazing. And I think that's allowed more and more and more student athletes to speak up and say, hey, we've been silent long enough, and this isn't good enough anymore. And I'm excited to be a part of that process. It's painful, but that's what you hear time and time again. That's growth. And for us to grow, we have to have these uncomfortable conversations. And I think this group here has been part of those uncomfortable conversations for years and years, but that it's becoming more public, to me, is a very, very great thing. And I see a lot of positive change coming.
Annie, I think that at OU, oh, sorry, Christy, do you want to go?
No, go ahead. You're good.
Yay, Zoom. I think one of the things we've done 2 of our monthly coaches education sessions during COVID on recruiting. So like, when you get to recruit again, here's some things we want you to think about around best practices for diversity and inclusion, right? Do you know what the campus offices are? Here are the links to them, right? You know what Athletes United is. We want our coaches to have a fluency in being able to describe, hey, we have these groups. And I think to what folks are mentioning, parents have been much more explicit in asking about that. Hey, here's what I know about Norman. Here's what we've heard from family friends about OU and Norman. What's your response to that? But I think on the flip side, one of the interesting things we got from our Black staff and administrators is how tokenized they feel during that recruiting process on occasion, when they are brought in to meet with the Black family, but the following weekend, if it's a white identified family, that they're not brought in. And their position hasn't changed, right? Like, they're still a senior administrator and chief of staff or director of student athlete well-being. And so we've really encouraged our coaches to think critically about who is in your recruiting visit, who are you leaving out, and who are you including from a well-intentioned space, but is still being harmful. And I think those administrators and staff members sharing that perspective was really eye-opening for coaches. And again, that we're trying to get from the recruiting standpoint to be seen in a proactive stance rather than a reactive. So I'm not waiting for parents to ask me. I'm from the get-go saying, hey, I realize my team right now, they may not look like you. Let me talk to you about our history of recruiting. Let me talk to you about what the department's doing, what I'm doing as a coach to better myself. And I will say, after George Floyd's murder, a lot of our coaches have really taken that on. Like, they're educating, they're trying to have better language for things like that, to talk to staff and student athletes and their families in a more skillful and mindful way.
I was just going to say, I'm speaking just on having conversations with student athletes about their experience in Lawrence. I am a native Kansan, so I've lived in Kansas my whole life. I'm very aware about the non-diverse aspect of it. And so I really tried to be very open about that and understanding that, and hope to have a conversation about that and how it, the difficulty, especially coming from some of the environments, some of our student athletes or neighborhoods or states that have much more diversity. So I've been honored that some student athletes have been able to talk about how difficult the transition has been, and that's why they maybe stick to their team or their teammates only, and that's where they feel the trust, and where you kind of see the isolation, and that they can only stick to their team because that's where they feel safe, and things are not understanding maybe or the feeling of social pressures of being part of a team, and not understanding maybe some of not wanting to maybe break a rule or something, or say something out that will get them in trouble. But then that anger that they can't just be openly who they are. Some of the student athletes I reach out to after the George Floyd incident, I have to say I was vulnerable in myself and saying, I recognize that I am a middle class woman. I mean, these are student athletes that I have met with continually, and I just said that I was, I understand I'm a middle-aged woman, a privilege that I'd lived in Kansas. They knew my background, right? So, but that I was there for them, that to please reach out, and that they appreciated me reaching out and just understanding that I was a woman of privilege, and they were openly shared that with me. And that was, it did not affect me because I understood that. And so I think it's been great dialogue back and forth with student athletes about where they know where I stand and I know where they stand, but I still feel like some student athletes unsure of whether or not they can use their voice. And I think that the great thing is that some dialogue has happened where they feel comfortable or sharing it and using their platforms to share their stories, and are saying it publicly for the and not, they're using on Twitter and things like that, and they're saying not anymore. And I have been cheering them on from all of your schools, and following all of their journeys, and appreciating that they're being so vulnerable to be able to do that.
So maybe here's a related question to this conversation. I guess I'm really curious about how you see minority stress playing out in the, from a mental health treatment standpoint within the therapy room, either pre or post George Floyd. And then I guess, two-parting this question a little bit related to that, like, how have you been intentional in addressing those issues as they come up in the therapy room? How have you been intentional about providing services to our athletes who identify with a minority identity?
I think in a way back 1,000 years ago in graduate school, when they talk about when you initiate therapy with someone, oftentimes they're going to feel worse before they feel better, because you're coming in and you're admitting, yeah, this is a problem. And so I see some parallels there. People are being more open about it. People are actually admitting a problem. And so initially I'm seeing some student athletes of color feels like, it's worse. Okay, now everybody's admitting it. It's real. And my hope is, we continue that, and those student athletes are going to see in the long run, okay, we're going to do this work, and it is going to be better. So yeah, I've found just kind of in my sessions, that started to click with me, that type of way that we often explain therapy to our clients early on in the sessions, it fits with some of their experiences. And so my hope is, we continue having these conversations and then take intentional action. I love that people everywhere. They're talking about, all right, what action are we going to take? What action are we going to take? But what I like about this group is we're saying, let's listen and assess before we just jump into action, because we might go 15 different directions and that might all be wrong. But our conversations have revolved around, let's be intentional in assessing what those needs are and then take action on that.
For me, I've just kind of brought it up about, how are you doing with the racial tensions that are going on? So one session I had, and I knew this athlete fairly well, but she was a Black woman, and she kind of asked me, like, well, what's it like for you? Because I don't know, because she said, I don't know what it's like. I mean, because you're white. What's this like for you? So, that was kind of interesting for me to talk about that, because, I mean, my, emotions of frustration that I was expressing, but also feeling like, even though I have these feelings, I mean, I'm also feeling like that it's probably not the intensity that she must be experiencing as a Black woman in our, not necessarily in college, but just in our society. And so, and one of the things that she felt was kind of a lot of pressure to use her platform as what was her words, but also in feeling that that would open up a lot of stress, so mental health concerns for her, because she was feeling like, okay, I'm supposed to use my platform, but if I start kind of opening that up, then I'm going to be experiencing a lot of stress and anxiety. So yeah, I don't know what to do. And so trying to help her navigate that was a situation I hadn't been in before. But yeah, just to hear her sense of kind of pressure that she was feeling to say something. And so anyway.
I've always appreciated that interpersonal process in therapy where we can just kind of own our own identities in the room and ask our clients, kind of like what we're all alluding to, like, what has it been like for you to share this with a white identified therapist, and kind of like talking about those differences in us to get that rich conversation and that connection. But similar to what Matt's saying, like, not only being intentional with checking in with our student athletes of color, but I've also just tried to be really intentional with still making sure we're checking in with our white student athletes too, with how they're being impacted, because obviously how our white student athletes are going to move forward from this as well is going to have an impact on their student athletes on the other student athletes in terms of like the impact and everything moving forward, right? And challenging their own privilege and things like that. So I think we talked about this with counseling center folks this week with how it can be easy to like not have those conversations with white students on campus, and how are we also just making sure we're not letting that pass us by, because that's going to be important moving forward too.
I think that's a good point. We're seeing conversations, or we're having conversations with Black student athletes about their direct experiences. How is this directly impacting them? How is it reminding them of their own experiences of racism and discrimination? Our white student athletes are coming in asking how to demonstrate their allyship, or at various levels, people discussing their privileges. Some of them may be understanding it better, some of them struggling with what does that mean, and really trying to be intentional about how do you support that aspect of this as well. And I think the one thing that's been really standing out to me that I maybe initially was missing or didn't anticipate is our non-Black student athletes of color being like, well, what about us? Where do we fit into this conversation? I've experienced racism and discrimination. How do I share within this experience right now of Black Lives Matter? And I didn't anticipate that coming up, but I mean, I can definitely understand where it's like, hey, yeah, where do I fit in as a Hispanic student athlete around this?
One of the surprising things to me is as our football athletes have been coming back, and I do mental health screening with all of them. And so as I've been sitting in these one-on-ones and asking them the question about how they're feeling, how they're coping, how they're dealing. I've had a few that have said, this has been most of my life. And so 18, 19, 20, like this has been happening for at least half of their life. And a lot of them are like, I'm fine. It just feels like another incident. And in some ways it's very saddening to see how it just feels normal for them. And so trying to have conversations around that, because they've put this in a place of, this is just a normal month. It's just a normal occurrence. And it's really not. And trying to help them dig a little deeper. And even though they may feel like it's normal, like, what are you feeling underneath that? And how do you feel as a person of color? So that's something that I've noticed. And then just for me personally, having to hold the tension of just also being a person of color, you know, and having student athletes sometimes ask me, they're like, well, you know, I know you have a husband, I have a young son, you know, how am I feeling about it? And kind of being taken off guard and trying to maintain like my head and not allow myself to think about that personally. So that's been a really hard tension for me to hold sometimes when having these conversations, and really having to, like Trevor said, go back to grad school and pull out some of those skills about not letting my own issues enter the space when I'm working with my student athletes.
Yeah. I appreciate you naming that, Monique, because I think part of how I've addressed it in sessions, and really echoing what Dana said, is we're just explicit, like, hey, this I've been tracking what's going on, and I wanted to start by checking in with you about how you're doing with it. I'm not normally that directive at the beginning, so that was also for me to get used to and to like own the beginning of the session. But doing that explicitly with the white identified student athletes I see, and then part of, I think, if I'm trying to be anti-racist in my life, I need to respect that I got here through work and journey and people mentoring me. And that student athlete who's 18, 19, 20, like they're drinking from a fire hose right now. So being a little bit more self-disclosing, a little bit more like, yeah, it's been, I hear that, or yeah, I used to say that too. And here's maybe another way of looking at it, more so than I would be probably for other issues, and certainly not with all clients, but I think it presented this opportunity from a mental health standpoint to talk about vulnerability and transparency, and to say that, yeah, I want to be transparent with you in this moment. Here's how I'm hearing you say this, and here's how I've kind of navigated that in the past, which was slightly uncomfortable, but to Dana's point, could have easily avoided with my white student athletes. Could have just started, you know, where we've been working, but they're having those conversations with their coaches, with their teammates, and their group me's and their team meetings. So if there's a space for them to kind of debrief and unload and then learn and grow, that they can go back into that space more educated, more comfortable being an advocate, whatever it happens to be, I think that still falls under the mental health advocacy umbrella.
Reminds me of what one mentor told me in my cohort, that every interaction we have with another human being is a multicultural experience. And when I remind myself of that, I'm going to have those conversations with whether they identify as white, brown, black, other.
Yeah. And I'd also add, just, it kind of goes back to what Christy was saying. So how proactive are we being outside of national events, right? How often are you, or I'll just say for me, how often am I naming what that experience is like being a Black student athlete here at OU, being a Black person in their chem class, and they're the only Black person in their chem class? What has been their experience on that? And I think pushing myself to name it more explicitly means when it comes up in a national spotlighted sense, it's part of our work already. It's part of the conversations we're having already. And I know for our student athletes, they were really vocal about the staff members who they see in those spaces. So our facilitators for Athletes United, I'm one of the ones for the White Ally Group, who are at sale events or connecting with the Diversity and Inclusion Subcommittee of our SAC, who are at the protests that we had in Norman. Those student athletes said, you know, I appreciate it so much. Like, I recognize you're there. I also recognize so-and-so who's not here. And that fits with them. That we, I think as mental health professionals, we got to get out of our offices and to be proactive in the same way we want our coaches and administrators and staff members to, that we can model that for them.
This has been an interesting, oh, sorry.
No, go you.
It's just been an interesting intersection of, you know, the pandemic happening. So we don't have our athletes in the little bubble of K-State athletics anymore. They're at their homes. And then the most recent wave of racial tension and racist events. And it's been interesting to have to navigate that. I cannot just open my office door now and kind of keep a pulse on how things are going. I have to rely on also educating our athletic trainers and the coaches who are sending out surveys and putting the most eyes on folks on all the ways that stress and distress and mental health symptoms can prevent, like, you know, picking up the phone, responding to text messages, sleep patterns changing. So it's not just, I'm so sad I can't get off the couch. It's maybe I'm angry, maybe I'm getting into fights, but also checking in on, are their basic needs being met back home? Are they safe back home? Do they know what resources they have in their hometown to go to? And so that's been an extra challenge during all of this, to try to feel really supportive and adequate in that support for our athletes.
And while COVID, as our health, right, was where all focus has been, it's so important for their health and mental health to advocate for themselves. So social isolating and being able to advocate for themselves do not go together. So encouraging them to be able to advocate outside of their home in a safe environment by masking up, right? It's okay, right? And so that has been, as we've seen, another topic of conversation is, how can you advocate for yourself in public forum while COVID is still circulating, and still be supported in that measure, and how important that is for us to support our student athletes to be able to do that, and realize how important it is for them to use their voice to do that, while they're hopefully using safety protocols, right? I don't know if conversations around if you guys have had those same similar conversations of, yes, I want you to use your voice. I don't want you to be silenced. I want you to be able to speak up, but please wear your mask. Yeah, please wear your mask.
Yeah.
And wash your hands.
So, just being aware of the time, there was one question that I really wanted to bring up that I think is on my mind, and Trevor mentioned it earlier. And so I really think this is a good group to ask this. And really, it's just figuring out if anybody has thoughts around, how does an institution like our athletic departments incorporate action items, dialogues, and education to best promote this, an anti-racist environment? Because for me, all three are great, but any one of them by themselves, while necessary, is not sufficient. And so how do you balance those things when, I think we can all probably say that we're seeing a lot of those action items come up and they're important, but I know personally here at Texas Tech, what student athletes are saying is that's great. And I feel like we need more. And whenever it's just the action items, they find that as a Black student athlete, they may be the only people actually participating in that action item, whereas their white student athlete teammates are not there. And so I think for me, that's the difficult thing that I see. And how do you really approach this from a comprehensive standpoint?
Something I picked up on just your language there, Tyler, just like you talk about with clients, you used and instead of but, which is, I think, great, because you're acknowledging, okay, this is progress and we want to do more. And I think just getting people to realize that and instead of a but, changes the dynamic of what you say. That is very, very picky with language, but it speaks volumes. So that people, if we can encourage our staff and our student athletes to use that we're going to acknowledge on the one hand, all right, we're at least having these conversations and that's progress. And it's not a finished product. So I think just something as simple as the language of an and versus but can go a long way.
I think getting people to trust the process. Athletics is so fast-paced and dynamic, and I need to see it now. And part of that has been, well, how are our student athletes going to know if we're not telling them that we've done a staff anti-racism book club? And it's like, one, you don't do it for the cookie. So none of us are here to be like, are you seeing out loud? But to get them to see, they'll know. they'll know because you will show up for them differently. You will be more intentional with your language. You will think about things differently. And we've seen coaches who have attended our full education series, they ask different questions in July than they did in March. And so getting kind of that idea of we don't have to be flashy and external with everything that we're doing. We will with some initiatives and hires and things like that. But the rest of it, we just have to trust that process of trust building. And it's okay that our Black student athletes don't trust the department yet. Why have we given them a reason to at this point? What have we done? We've done small things for them, but if they're like, yeah, well, let's see how this looks in January or, in September when school starts, they have a right to feel that way. We just have to keep doing the work regardless. And then that and comes together, hopefully, towards progress.
That's a good reminder for ourselves too, Dolores. Like, I think when we jump to action items or when we're also like trying to ride the wave of this momentum and put all these things in place, we might feel frustrated, like, why did only 10 student athletes show up on this call or whatever? And maybe that would contribute to us like wanting to decrease, like putting things together moving forward. And I think we just need to, again, we need to be patient with that process as well and trust in that process and recognize those small shifts, those small successes, and how we build off of that moving forward. Because there is going to still, like you just said, there's still going to be that trust piece. And for us to really like still be committed to that work right now, I think would be really helpful.
Yeah, there's definitely a delicate balance. I hear some of our student athletes of color, if things are done too quickly, they'll go to, well, what if they don't mean it? Or, so I think it's a delicate balance between not only hearing and understanding, and then also action.
I think we also oftentimes hear people say, I want to do something, like the action item piece, but they're not quite sure what to do. And so that's another reason why I really love this group, because every time we get together and someone's like, oh, we're doing this, like I'm writing it down because I don't have to create it. We just need to do it. And so sometimes thinking that, oh, we have to have this new thing or we have to come up with something specifically to Baylor, we can borrow something from OU and Baylorize it. Today, Dolores, that you know what we're doing, like that's some great stuff. And I think sometimes people get caught in like trying to figure out what to do. And it's like, there are plenty of other institutions that are already doing things. Like, we're here to support each other as Big 12 member institutions. And so I love this group because we do that. And I know it's helped me think about ways to support our student athletes here at Baylor.
So maybe one of the most important things though, Monique, are you referencing OU when you do that?
Well, I guess I just did, Matt, because I said it out loud. So
it's being recorded, right?
It is being recorded. So.
Can't take it back now.
I can't. Well, like Tyler said, do want to be aware of everyone's time and so thankful for everyone getting on today and sharing in our roundtable conversation. Again, July is Minority Mental Health Month, so we are really wanting to explore how mental health impacts our minority student athletes. And so this has been a great conversation. I'm really proud to know and get to work with all of you all in some capacity. And so I look forward to additional roundtable conversations related to student athlete mental health. So thank you for participating and giving of your time today.
Mental health conditions do not discriminate based on race, color, gender, or identity. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, approximately 1 in 5 adults in the United States experience mental illness in a given year. There tends to be a misconception that receiving mental health support is only for the most severe circumstances or for the weak. However, many individuals seek mental health support for help in adjusting to life circumstances or with managing common everyday stressors. It takes a strong person to admit they need help. If you or someone you know is struggling with any mental health symptoms, please contact the National Helpline or the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. For more information on Minority Mental Health Month, please visit either of the links below.